Assalamu alaikum. Today we're going to discuss a critical aspect about interpreting the Quran and part of the methodology that I was able to uncover with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from within the Quran. We're going to deal with a fun example from Surah Yusuf. It relates to verse number 67. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reporting to us what Prophet Yaqub said to his children as he instructed them before their second trip to Misr, to Egypt. He said, "My children, do not enter from a single door and enter from multiple doors." Now, right away, this verse raises several questions. First question that's most obvious is, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala repeat two sentences back to back that seem to have the exact same meaning? The second question is, what is the motivation for Prophet Yaqub to instruct his children to do as he did? Now, we're not going to be able to get to the answer of both of these questions unless we go through a number of evidences to allow us to see how, using this methodology, we can extract real information, reliable, authoritative information that allows us to truly make the correct decision. So to do this, let's start with another verse and another key term. We go to verse number 50 from Surah Yusuf, chapter 12 again. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reporting to us what the king said. وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ ائْتُونِي بِهِ. This is after Yusuf has been imprisoned and he has interpreted the report that was given to him about the king, and the king wanted to meet Yusuf. The king says, "Bring him to me." ائْتُونِي بِهِ. It's very clear. Verse number 54 from the same surah, the same thing. وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ ائْتُونِي بِهِ. This is the second time after Yusuf refused to come out the first time and asked him to investigate the gossiping women. After the king investigated the gossiping women, the king requested that they bring Yusuf to him again. Notice, ائْتُونِي بِهِ, bring him to me. And the key thing to understand here is that this verb ائْتُونِي بِهِ, which is أتى به, is the past tense singular of the same verb. أتى به, right? Bring him implies or necessitates that Yusuf is not with the king at the time the king issued that instruction. This is very critical to understand. This is the precision that we're seeking in the term ائْتُونِي بِهِ. Verse number 59. وَلَمَّا جَهَّزَهُمْ بِجَهَازِهِمْ قَالَ ائْتُونِي بِأَخٍ لَكُمْ مِنْ أَبِيكُمْ. And when Yusuf prepared their travel packs, he said, "Bring me a brother of yours from your father." And this is clear that Yusuf was telling the siblings, "Bring me that younger brother." That younger brother was not with Yusuf or the siblings at this time. He was back with his father. So he used ائْتُونِي بِهِ. So in the Quran, in Surah Yusuf, whenever the Quran uses ائْتُونِي بِهِ, it indicates that the thing or the person he's talking about is not with them at the time. We continue to verse number 83 from the same surah. And this is reported about Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam, where he's saying, عَسَى اللَّهُ أَن يَأْتِيَنِي بِهِمْ جَمِيعًا إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْعَلِيمُ الْحَكِيمُ. I pray to Allah that He brings them all to me. Indeed, He is the most knowledgeable, the most wise. Notice, يَأْتِيَنِي بِهِمْ. Bring them, because they're not with him at this time. Of course, he was talking about the three sons who are missing, Yusuf and the youngest one, and the third son who refused to come after the second trip. Now, why all of this is so important is because we're trying to focus on precisely understanding the locution used by the Quran with regards to the verb أتى به. In verse number 66, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that when the children of Yaqub returned from their first trip, they asked that Yaqub sends with them the youngest one, based on Yusuf's instruction back in Misr or Egypt. After a long dialogue that took place, Yaqub requested from his children that they give him an oath in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they will bring him. Now, the question is, who is him? I looked up all of the interpretations and I looked up all of the translations, and they all translated this verb تَأْتُنَّنِ بِهِ in this verse to mean return him to me, meaning he was referring to the youngest son. And of course, we saw in all the other verses I just read for you that ata bihi is to bring him. He's talking about someone who is not with him at the time. And therefore, in verse number 66, لَتَأْتُنَّنِي bihi, and you see it there circled, it's not talking about someone currently with Yaqub. In other words, it's not talking about the youngest son who is currently with Yaqub. This is really critical because unless you understand this concept, that means you don't understand the story. Here's the key issue. The key issue is that when the children returned from their first trip, Yaqub and the other children already knew that Yusuf was alive. And Yaqub was insisting that if you take the youngest one with you to Egypt, it will be on the condition that you give me an oath that you bring Yusuf to me. You bring Yusuf to me. He was not negotiating about bringing back the youngest one. That was already a done deal. He was negotiating about an extra condition regarding Yusuf. Yusuf needed to come with them. In other words, this is a new condition which proves that Yaqub and the siblings of Yusuf knew that Yusuf was alive already in Egypt. Now, why is this so important? Now we go to verse number 67, which is وَقَالَ يَا بَنِيَّ لَا تَدْخُلُوا مِنْ بَابٍ وَاحِدٍ وَادْخُلُوا مِنْ أَبْوَابٍ مُتَفَرِّقَةٍ. And he said, my children, do not enter from a single door and enter from multiple doors. Now, why did he say this? I'll tell you, according to the various interpreters I've read, all of them implied that what Yaqub was worried about was something called the evil eye, or that jealousy would hurt his children if people knew that he had so many children. And of course that didn't make sense at all, because on their first trip they all entered at the same time and he was not worried about it. So what changed? Briefly, the answer is as follows. Because Yaqub and the children knew that Yusuf was in Egypt, and yet they did not know his true identity. Because Yusuf had a job that required him to be incognito, meaning his appearance hid his true identity. He did not want people to know who he was. And that's why the brothers or the siblings did not recognize him on the first trip. They knew he was alive, but they didn't know exactly who he was. And therefore their mission on their second trip, instructed by their father Yaqub, was to identify Yusuf and to bring him to his father. Now, in order to identify him, Yaqub created this genius plan that says Yusuf would know his youngest brother, but if it's not Yusuf, he would not know his youngest brother. In other words, the person who requested the youngest brother to come with the siblings would either be Yusuf or would not be Yusuf. If it is Yusuf and they enter separately, Yusuf would recognize the youngest one even if not accompanied by all the other ones whom he saw before. Therefore he told them, enter separately, so he does not recognize you together and therefore guess that the extra youngest one would be the youngest brother. And the siblings would have an opportunity to identify who that person is, meaning Yusuf. If that person is not Yusuf and he just knew about this somehow, then he would not recognize the youngest brother entering alone. It's a very smart, very creative, very genius plan to allow the siblings to pinpoint who Yusuf was. Now, we're back to the initial question, which is, why do we have two sentences that seem to be repeating the same meaning? Do not enter from a single door and enter through multiple doors. Is there extraneous kind of composition in the Quran in here? And this is what it seems to be, right? At the surface. As a matter of fact, all the interpreters skimmed over this issue and never dealt with it. The answer basically is that the first door, do not enter through a single door, is a physical door. And enter through multiple doors, he's telling them, when you go to execute your mission, which is to identify Yusuf and bring him to his father, try multiple ways, try different approaches. In other words, the second doors is a metaphorical example. And this is part of the locution of the Quran. This is part of the Abrahamic locution that we talked about in a prior segment. So therefore, he's telling them, enter physically in separate entrances, and when you try to figure out who Yusuf is, figure out multiple approaches to achieve your mission. And indeed, when we read the story that relates to the events of the second trip in Misr, they tried multiple things. And this explains why we have two different sentences that seem to be saying the same thing, but in reality they're not saying the same thing. Now, the conclusion here is that the interpreters of the Quran and the translators of the Quran, unfortunately, none of them paid attention to these issues. None of them really gave creed to the precision of using the terminology and the locution in terms of the verb ata bihi, bring him. And they all translated that verb in verse number 66 to return him or to bring him back. And that's not what the discussion was all about. Therefore, that allowed several damages. The first one is that it did not allow us to understand the story of Yusuf correctly. The second one, it allowed the interpreters of the Quran to inject a creed, aqidah, relating to jealousy and the evil eye that was absolutely not there in the story. The third one, it deprived us of truly understanding the genius of the plan that Yaqub had weaved and instructed his children to carry. The fourth problem is that it made us misunderstand another verse. Let's go to verse number 93, where it says, اذهبوا بقميصي هذا فألقوه على وجه أبي يأتي بصيرا. Take my shirt, this shirt, and throw it in the path of my father. He will come with insight. That's the correct interpretation and translation. It was interpreted and translated that when you throw the shirt on his face, his blindness would go away and he would return to be able to see again. And unfortunately, that's the very wrong interpretation of this verse. As a matter of fact, when we get to Surah Yusuf, we will see that there is no such thing as Yaqub going blind. And I know two other verses may hint at that, but when we deal with those verses, we will clear them up and we will see directly, firsthand, convincingly, that Yaqub never went blind. Now, why did the interpreters and why did the translators of the Quran insist on this? Because it came from the corrupted version of the Torah, which reports a story similar to this about Joseph, and where it says that Jacob went blind. Now, one last point. When we talked about the doors, the first use of doors in verse number 67 deals with a physical door, meaning do not enter through a single entrance or a single door. He's talking about physically don't enter into one door, enter separately. And the second one, enter through multiple doors. He's talking about a metaphorical door. Those doors, the second one, the metaphorical one, explains to us the doors that were referenced in the scene where the woman supposedly seduced Yusuf, where the verse number 23 says, وَغَلَّقَتِ الْأَبْوَابِ. It was translated as, she closed all the doors and locked them up. And that's not the correct translation. Here, the doors are metaphorical. And once we understand that these doors are metaphorical, the whole scene changes and it no longer refers to sexual seduction. There are other evidences that we will present, inshallah, when we talk about the Surah of Yusuf in a later segment. Now, when we go to Surah Yusuf and detail it in future segments, inshallah, you will see that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ received a huge, major training in Surah Yusuf. It wasn't just a silly story about a woman who seduced her young man who lived in her house. It wasn't about the king wasting his time investigating a sexual harassment case. It wasn't about any of this stuff. It was about something very serious related to state security that trained the Prophet ﷺ ahead of his migration to Medina. And from Surah Yusuf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was instructing and training the Prophet ﷺ to learn major lessons and prepare him to run the state, to maintain the security within the state, and how to defend the people of that state. I hope this was useful for you. Thank you for watching.